in his hand. Below the dial was a little platform, and at either end of it rose two miniature sentry boxes, with closed doors. Externally, this was all that appeared, until the magic moment came when the clock struck 12 noon. It wanted then about 3 minutes to 12, and Major Milroy seized the opportunity of explaining what the exhibition was to be before the exhibition began. At the first words, his mind fell back again into its old absorption over the one employment of his life. He turned to Midwinter, who had persisted in talking all the way from the parlor, and who was talking still, without a trace left in his manner of the cool and cutting composure which he had spoken but a few minutes before. The noisy, familiar man, who had been an ill-bred intruder in the parlor, became a privileged guest in the workshop, for there he possessed the all-atoning social advantage of being new to the performances of the wonderful clock. "At the first stroke of 12, Mr. Midwinter," said the major quite eagerly, "keep your eye on the figure of Time. He will move his scythe and point it downward to the glass pedestal. You will next see a little printed card appear behind the glass, which will tell you the day of the month and the day of the week. At the last stroke of the clock, Time will lift his scythe again into its former position, and the chimes will ring a peal. The peal will be succeeded by the playing of a tune, the favorite march of my old regiment, and then the final performance of the clock will follow. The sentry boxes, which you may observe at each side, will both open at the same moment. In one of them you will see the sentinel appear, and from the other a corporal and two privates will march across the platform to relieve the guard, and will then disappear, leaving the new sentinel at his post. I must ask your kind allowances for this last part of the performance. The machinery is a little complicated, and there are defects in it which I am ashamed to say I have not yet succeeded in remedying as I could wish. Sometimes the figures go all wrong, and sometimes they go all right. I hope they may do their best on the occasion of your seeing them for the first time." As the major, posted near his clock, said the last words, his little audience of three, assembled at the opposite end of the room, saw the hour hand and the minute hand on the dial point together to 12. The first stroke sounded, and Time, true to the signal, moved his scythe. The day of the month and the day of the week announced themselves in print through the glass pedestal next. Midwinter, applauding their appearance with a noisy exaggeration of surprise, which Miss Milroy mistook for coarse sarcasm directed at her father's pursuits, and which Allan, seeing that she was offended, attempted to moderate by touching the elbow of his friend. Meanwhile, the performances of the clock went on, and at the last stroke of 12, Time lifted his scythe again, the chimes rang, the march of the major's old regiment followed, and the crowning exhibition of the relief of the guard announced itself in a preliminary trembling of the sentry boxes and a sudden disappearance of the major at the back of the clock. The performance began with the opening of the sentry box on the right-hand side of the platform, as punctually as could be desired. The door on the other side, however, was less tractable. It remained obstinately closed. Unaware of this hitch in the proceedings, the corporal and his two privates appeared in their places in a state of perfect discipline, tottered out across the platform, all three trembling in every limb, dashed themselves headlong against the closed door on the other side, and failed in producing the smallest impression of the immovable sentry presumed to be within. An intermittent clicking of the major's keys and tools at work was heard in the machinery. The corporal and his two privates suddenly returned, backward, across the platform, and shut themselves up with a bang inside their own door. Exactly at that moment the other door opened for the first time, and the provoking sentry appeared with the utmost deliberation at his post, waiting to be relieved. He was allowed to wait. Nothing happened in the box but an occasional knocking inside the door, as if the corporal and his privates were impatient to be let out. The clinking of the major's tools was heard again among the machinery. The corporal and his party, suddenly restored to liberty, appeared in a violent hurry, and spun furiously across the platform. Quick as they were, however, the hitherto deliberate sentry on the other side now perversely showed himself to be quicker still. He disappeared like lightning into his own premises. The door closed smartly after him. The corporal and his privates dashed themselves headlong against it for the second time, and the major, appearing again round the corner of the clock, asked his audience innocently if they would be good enough to tell him whether anything had gone wrong. The fantastic absurdity of the exhibition, heightened by Major Milroy's grave inquiry at the end of it, was so irresistibly ludicrous that the visitors shouted with laughter, and even Miss Milroy, with all her consideration for her father's sensitive pride in his clock, could not restrain herself from joining in the merriment which the catastrophe of the puppets had provoked. But there are limits even to the license of laughter, and these limits were ere long so outrageously overstepped by one of the little party as to have the effect of almost instantly silencing the other two. The fever of Midwinter's false spirits flamed out into sheer delirium as the performance of the puppets came to an end. His paroxysms of laughter followed each other with such convulsive violence that Miss Milroy started back from him in alarm, and even the patient major turned on him with a look which said plainly, "Leave the room." Allan, wisely impulsive for once in his life, seized Midwinter by the arm, and dragged him out by main force into the garden, and thence into the park beyond. "Good heavens, what has come to you?" he exclaimed, shrinking back from the tortured face before him, as he stopped and looked close at it for the first time. For the moment, Midwinter was incapable of answering. The hysterical paroxysm was passing from one extreme to the other. He leaned against a tree, sobbing and gasping for breath, and stretched out his hand in a mute entreaty to Allan to give him time. "You had better not have nursed me through my fever," he said, faintly, as soon as he could speak. "I'm mad and I'm miserable. Allan, I have never recovered it. Go back and ask them to forgive me. I'm ashamed to go and ask them myself. I can't tell how it happened. I can only ask your pardon and theirs." He turned aside his head quickly, so as to conceal his face. "Don't stop here," he said. "Don't look at me. I shall soon get over it." Allan still hesitated, and begged hard to be allowed to take him back to the house. It was useless. "You break my heart with your kindness," he burst out passionately. "For God's sake, leave me by myself." Allan went back to the cottage, and pleaded there for indulgence to Midwinter with an earnestness and simplicity which raised him immensely in the major's estimation, but which totally failed to produce the same favorable impression on Miss Milroy. Little as she herself suspected it, she was fond enough of Allan already to be jealous of Allan's friend. "How excessively absurd!" she thought, pettishly, as if either papa or I considered such a person of the slightest consequence. "You will kindly suspend your opinion, won't you, Major Milroy?" said Allan, in his hearty way at parting. "With the greatest pleasure," replied the major, cordially shaking hands. "And you too, Miss Milroy?" added Allan. Miss Milroy made a merciless formal bow. "My opinion, Mr. Armadale, is not of the slightest consequence." Allan left the cottage, sorely puzzled to account for Miss Milroy's sudden coolness toward him. His grand ideal of conciliating the whole neighborhood by becoming a married man underwent some modification as he closed the garden gate behind him. The virtue called prudence and the Squire of Thorpe Ambrose became personally acquainted with each other on this occasion for the first time, and Allan, entering headlong as usual on the high road to moral improvement, actually decided on doing nothing in a hurry. A man who is entering on a course of reformation ought, if virtue is its own reward, to be a man engaged in an essentially inspiriting pursuit. But virtue is its own reward, and the way that leads to reformation is remarkably ill-lighted for so respectable a thoroughfare. Allan seemed to have caught the infection of his friend's despondency. As he walked home, he, too, began to doubt, in his widely different way, for his wildly different reasons, whether the life of Thorpe Ambrose was promising quite as fairly for the future as it had promised at first. End of chapter 6. Recorded by Michael Anthony Petronic.